Have you ever had the feeling where the lump catches in your throat and grief feels to overwhelm you? There are so many losses that can happen throughout the course of a life, and grief is about more than death or dying. It is equally universal and deeply personal. Today on Shak, we have Janelle Chase-Mayers, who has worked as a creative and systemic therapist and a wellness coach for the past 12 years. She's also a part-time lecturer at the Barbados Community College and the University of the West Indies in social work and psychology. Janelle manages her own CrossFit gym and is the owner of the Fit Chick movement, which focuses on the integrated wellness of women. Janelle is also the chief heart operator of Grief Recovery Works, specializing in corporate grief training. Welcome, Janelle, and thanks for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I think we should probably start with what exactly is grief, and would you say it has a function, or is kind of just the way things are, a fact of life?
Okay, so I'll just give you a brief definition that I've learned over the years that works for me, where grief is a normal and natural reaction to loss of any kind. Mm-hmm. And in your introduction, you hit the nail on the head that it could be anything that's happening to somebody with regards to loss, and it's not just a death with regards to grief. But carry over a little bit more, grief is also the conflicting feelings caused by the end of or a change in a familiar pattern of behavior. Mm-hmm. And often when people are experiencing grief, they get a range of emotions that they're not quite sure what to do with it. And if you are not au fait with grief, you may think that somebody's going crazy. But I always tell people, like if you've lost something or have a shared experience of loss, sometimes you're not quite sure how to feel about it because you've never experienced it before. Take what's happening now with COVID in our society. Some people don't even know how to process having to stay in their house for a whole 3 months.
That's true.
Or not being able to go to school. Like their norm not being able to go to school is something that is so conflicting because I don't have to wake up in the morning early to get ready, but I also don't want to be in my house all day without my friends or without being able to go outside and play. So it's that conflicting feeling.
Okay. So I mentioned that you are the chief heart operator, which definitely is not a title you hear every day. Mm-hmm. So tell me about that and your path to working in grief recovery.
Okay, so I'm a certified grief recovery specialist through the Grief Recovery Institute, which is the only evidence-based program that deals with grief and loss for human beings. And with that, the evidence base is that they have worked over with thousands of people, and they can show you how the grief recovery process has actually been effective working with individuals who experience any type of loss. Mm-hmm. So my path with grief recovery is very interesting because when I was 27 years old, I lost my husband to asthma. He had an asthma attack. When at that time I was a new mother, 4 weeks, I had a baby who was 4 weeks old.
Wow.
And he got an asthma attack and he was hospitalized for 14 days and then he passed away. So imagine me, a new mother, a 6-week-old, having to bury her husband. At that time we were married 3 years, we have been dating 2 years, so we've been together 5-6 years, about that.
Wow. Yeah.
And but I was also a therapist at the same time.
Okay.
So I always tell people I had the world of therapy around me, even if I didn't want it, right? Mm-hmm. And I searched for years. I always searched because my thing about it was that grief was one of these things that you feel inherently in everything that you do.
Okay.
And milestones like my son's first birthday was something that was very hard. Or his ability to walk, or when he went into preschool, I didn't have anybody to share those experiences with because when I got pregnant, I didn't sign up not having a husband to help me parent.
It's true.
Right. So I walked with grief for a couple of years, and I always said, this is something that when I've gone through or completed my grief, that I want to be able to help people. Okay. So for years, I researched, what certifications will I do? And I stumbled on the grief recovery method, and I just researched it over and over. And it's a relatively expensive certification. We're talking almost like when you add in trip money and all of that stuff, we're talking about $10,000 worth of certification.
Wow.
And I was like, all right, how am I doing this? And I actually resigned my job because I was working as a mental health professional in a company for about 12 years. And I resigned my job, and along with launching the Fit Chip movement, I said, let me go ahead and do this certification, because this is something that I've always wanted to do. And I just went on a whim and I did it. And I had an awesome time with the individuals who did the certification with me. I have another friend who had lost her husband, who happened to be the person who married myself and my husband. She had lost her husband, and she came up and she did it with me as well too. So that's how I ended up really having a passion, and then having the education behind the passion to offer it as a service for people.
Okay, that's indeed an interesting story.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you talked about research and that kind of thing. So the standard literature on grief, directs us to like the 5 stages of grief: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. But, there have been some kind of divergent views on if this actually represents the grief process. So I'm just wondering if, you subscribe to the idea of the stages of grief, and if that's been your own experience personally or in your work.
So I would say, those stages are not correct. If you understand anything about Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's stages of grief, it was in relation to the person who was dying. It was never meant for the individual who has survived the death.
Okay.
But as people will have it, they don't read literature and research very well. And so then they decided that they were going to tack that on. And subsequently, what the co-author of that research has done is now added one other piece to then make it, to apply it to the individuals who are living.
Okay.
And one of the reasons why I don't subscribe to it is that, one, everybody has their own grieving process. And I've never been angry, and I've never been depressed. So if we say, I've always told people that whatever my situation was in my loss, right, there had to be a reason. And that's how I operated for me. Because I had a child. So I cannot have the energy of being angry and be a parent at the same time. That's like that couldn't work for me, right? So most people give that as very inaccurate information. And I do challenge people on that, because it wasn't designed for that.
Okay.
When I talk about grief in the world that I am in, we talk about it from the perspective of debunking some myths, right? And some of the myths, there are about 6 myths that we begin to look at. So one would be like, don't feel bad. People have this whole concept of telling people don't feel bad. And that's a big myth. Why wouldn't you feel bad? You know? Why wouldn't losing something or losing someone not feel good to you, right?
Yeah.
Another myth is replace the loss. Because you think like something like, if a child has to leave their particular house because their parents have to move, and the mother will say something like, well, you'll just get new friends, they'll just make new friends somewhere, but they're not acknowledging the loss of the current friends.
Yeah.
Another myth is grieve alone. People like to think that, people who are experiencing grief and loss don't want to talk to people. And I tell people that's not the case. They just don't want to talk to the wrong people. They want to talk to the right
Fair
people.
enough.
They want to talk to people who can hear them and they can cry with and stuff like that. But they don't want to talk with people that telling them, you got to cheer up, he want like you to do this, that kind of stuff. They don't want to have that conversation. Another myth is just give it time. Time heals all wounds. No, it does. Action heals wounds. If you were to break your foot, right, you will go to the hospital, you would get an x-ray, and you would then get a cast, and then after the cast, you would take off the cast and you would go physical therapy or occupational therapy, right?
Yeah.
Why don't we do that with a broken heart?
There's an interesting concept, yeah.
Yeah, we don't do it with a broken heart, but we know it's broken. So just give it time is one of the biggest myths. Another one is be strong for others. And I always question people who say, but I gotta be strong for this person. I said, but what about you? Because if you're taking the brunt of everybody's hurt and their grief, which, by the way, we can't for anybody, because grief is a very personal experience, as you said in your introduction, right? Then when do you get time to just not be strong? And then the final myth, keep busy, And I always tell people this with grief and loss: you can move the mountains during the day, but you see, when you come home and there's nobody or nothing else for you to do, and you lie down in your bed and those thought processes start to hit you, it gets very overwhelming for people. And that's one of the biggest myths, keep busy, keep busy so you don't feel. There was, I think, Beanie Man buried his mother. And there was a story of him, collapsing. And he said in the story, he just kept busy. And when he actually saw her going down the grave, it hit him like my mother gone. And he couldn't process it because he hadn't been processing it all the other time when he was just trying to keep busy, and keep his mind off of the problem that his mother had passed. So the stages of grief, I do wish that people would educate themselves about it more and understand that it does not have anything to do with the person who's living. And then allow people to also, feel how they need to feel. Because we always assume that people's intensity in death or losses are the same. We assume that everybody loved their mother the same way, or that they love the job the same way. We make some very big assumptions in grief that are not fair to people.
Okay. So, we talked about the 5 stages of grief. I guess one of the things I sometimes wonder, do feelings of happiness and positive emotion, would you say they coexist with grief?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, feelings are just feelings, right? And we are not emotional, we are emotion filled. And there are many times I can tell people that I lived in a consistent state of joy and sadness when I experienced the loss of my husband, because there was always joy of having my son and there was always sadness of not having my husband.
Okay.
And I navigated those two worlds for about 7 to 8 years, right? I would say as I went through my process and in the latter years, my life really then kind of flipped into joy, and I kind of released the sadness that carried me around, or I carried around in other relationships or in other things that I did. But I don't think it could have been different,
Okay.
That was my experience. And I think when you put a positive or negative stamp on emotion, you also make a right or wrong way of doing and feeling. And my thing is, you're either feeling effectively or ineffectively. That's how I frame it. So people can say, are these feelings adding value to your life right now, or are they taking away value from your life right now?
Okay. So, you talked about, the biggest myths about grief. I was curious about, would you say that there's a gendered approach to grieving? Are there differences between the ways men and women grieve?
Absolutely. I think as a society, there is a gender bias to emotions, and grief fall in the category of emotions. So therefore, we are not allowing our men to feel or be emotion filled with their experience of grief and loss. So if a man loses a job, it is not, settle yourself, that sort of stuff. It's like, all right, suck that, it's all going, you got to provide for your family, that kind of stuff. If a woman loses a job, you're going to provide support differently. Well, girl, don't worry, your children ain't going to starve. We bought you if you need food. So yes, I would definitely say that there is a gender bias surrounding grief. But then there's just a human bias surrounding grief anyway, because nobody's allowing anybody to feel. Grief is one of those misunderstood and neglected experiences of our life, but is the most common experience to our life, as love is. Those two things go hand in hand, love and grief. And we don't have conversations about the universality of grief and love.
So, I mean, you mentioned there about, like we don't allow people to grieve. Like, recently online, I've seen all these discussions about, people feel, I think public displays of grief seem to make people uncomfortable. We kind of judge the celebrities and that kind of thing
Yeah.
about how they should grieve, but, grief is very personal. So,
Yeah.
but I think it makes people uncomfortable somehow.
Yeah. Yeah. Others are ill prepared to help us deal with our loss.
Yes. Yes.
That's basically what it boils down to. One, they don't know what to say,
Mm-hmm.
right? Two, they're definitely afraid of our feelings. Three, they try to change the subject often.
Mm-hmm.
Four, they intellectualize. Five, they don't hear us when we actually speak. Six, they don't want to talk about death, if death
Yes.
is one of the things.
Yeah.
Seven, they want to keep us with faith, right? And it said God will give you more than you could bear and that kind of stuff. And so people are really ill prepared to deal with people's personal losses.
Yeah.
And it's only when people have experienced a level of loss can they begin identifying and, perhaps sharing compassion with individuals about how a loss has impacted their lives. But other than that, we live in a society where people want to be okay with everything being okay, but not okay with everything not being okay.
Yeah. Yeah. So I mentioned the idea of the gendered approach to, grief. But is there anything unique about the way we manage grief culturally, like in Barbados and the region?
Yes. So I'll start with one of the things I'm very curious about in terms of cultural components of grief. In Africa, there are certain tribes where when somebody actually passes away, the tribe holds space for that individual or that family for 30 days.
Mm-hmm.
And so you can imagine losing somebody and having other people hold space, whether it was in the form of making food, it was a form of financially providing, it was a form of emotional support, it was a form of physical touch, and really becoming part of that person's story after they lose somebody. So now let's backtrack now to Barbados and the Caribbean culture. And I'm assuming that you're talking about death as the main component.
Yes, but I mean,
Right.
if you want to expand on loss in general, up to you. But yeah.
So I'll start with death and then I'll expand a little bit on loss. So we have a mentality that, our friends show up when we lose somebody, but sometimes never show up in other situations.
Mm-hmm.
So one of my biggest pet peeves is my condolences, my deepest sympathy. Now we live in the technological age where if somebody loses somebody on Facebook, all of a sudden you see 100, 200 messages, and you look at the person's profile and nobody don't go on this body profile at all. But that is something now that everybody thinks they need to share, right? And for me, that's okay, but what purpose does it serve?
Mm-hmm.
Then we also have a cultural component that we spend way too much money on funerals.
Yeah, well, it is expensive.
Yes, you're talking the average funeral is about $18,000 to $20,000. And I'm not exaggerating, right? The whole itself to put down somebody is about $4,000, $5,000. If you're going to the private, if you're going to the public, it's about $800. So it costs to bury people. So we have a tradition where we make sure that people have a grand send off as well too. But what we don't realize is culturally, then people are catching their tails after the funeral, because 9 out of 10 times is one person that probably foot that bill and not everybody. What also happens culturally is that there's also a lot of familial divide, because we traditionally don't have wills or people saying, well, if I die, this is what is going to happen. So I would say from a cultural perspective, there's an element of turmoil that happens when we lose people, because our familial structure is not one of assuredness and almost nuclear perspective. So death brings mess, I would say, from a cultural perspective. And in the other losses, I think what we do from a cultural perspective is really brush off other losses. Divorces, separation, loss of jobs, down to something as simple but very heartwarming and heartful as losing a pet.
Yep.
Right? You see a cat dead in the road, you might be like, man, you just get another one, man. Cats is getting run over, you know? That's the sort of thing.
Yeah.
Almost it becomes a callous experience of these losses. And it's unfortunate that we don't pay so much attention to the fact that these losses do put people in an emotion-filled and sometimes a psychological state that their well-being is compromised.
Yeah. So that actually makes me think, you've raised the point there about, I guess, in some ways, what we might consider disenfranchised grief, or, the kind of grief that's unacknowledged and unvalidated by society.
Yeah.
So I guess that perhaps something that we see a lot culturally, as you mentioned, like pets, and I mean things are even a little bit more salacious than that, in terms of people sometimes are having extramarital affairs or same-sex unions, and they're not really allowed to grieve because they can't show it.
Yep.
So
I mean, even you look at something as like the past election, and everybody is so Biden, and I'm like, if you can't even see on the other side that people who voted for Trump are also experiencing a level of grief, then you miss the whole concept of the human factor. I take it back down to slavery. So everybody was enslaved, and I always tell people, so you think when slavery done, the slave masters get therapy for not being able to own people no more? They were also grieving too,
I suppose. So I guess people aren't as concerned about that.
Yeah, I'm not saying what they did was right, but what I'm saying, at the end of the day, people also have a level of emotions. And so when we don't deal with the emotions, certain things continue. That's why racism still continues. And that's why it will always continue, because we don't even want to acknowledge that both sides are in precarious situations, right? Because if that's all I know and that's what I lose, then what do I replace it with?
Well, yeah, that kind of leads me to my other question. How should people process and manage that kind of unvalidated grief, as it were?
I think I'll say what happens. I think we stay in our circles so we get validated. But unfortunately, if you're being validated with no new information, you're going to continue the cycle. So it's to get new information about how the loss has truly impacted you, right? And when we begin to get new information, we can actually begin completing the loss. Okay. Often we are scared to get the new information because we think that we may, forget somebody if it is somebody that, is actually a death of a loved one. Or we feel that if we go ahead and kind of deal with the loss of a job, that the other person who might have fired us or with the company that we worked at will start to look at us in a different light because we've gone somewhere else and getting more money and we're more established. We're scared of those things, right? And we don't really look to celebrate those things or complete those relationships in its entirety. So you can actually say, you know what, this no longer serves me. Right? My husband is no longer my husband. Right? If you say, oh, but he's always your husband. Yeah, but if I keep referring to him as always my husband, what happens to me when I'm trying to engage into new relationship?
Yeah.
And so people struggle with completing the loss, but new information allows people to begin truly completing the loss and the nature of the relationships that they've lost.
Okay. So, I mean, are there consequences, I imagine there are, of unprocessed grief, or is grief but I guess the other part of that is grief always processed one way or the other, whether voluntarily or not, or,
My thing would be, is it processed effectively or ineffective?
Fair enough. That
It's
makes
all
sense.
it's
Mm-hmm.
always processed, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But what we've kind of done is actually replace grief with depression.
Hmm.
And that's a very dangerous thing to do to people who are actually just experiencing the loss, of anything. Why wouldn't you be sad? Why wouldn't it be overwhelming for you to get out of bed? Why wouldn't you consider sometimes, that this is too hard and you don't want to be part of this process? It doesn't mean that you're going to do something. And I think what we've done is almost pathologize the experience of grief,
Mm-hmm.
right? And we don't give people permission to really miss or lose something. We always want to make them feel better. And there are certain situations that nobody can make me feel better at losing my husband.
Mm-hmm.
There was nothing you could say. There was nothing that you could do. There wasn't any book that you threw in my head. You know, it was just a moment that I needed to feel how I felt. Tell people I used to have a cloak, figuratively, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where when I always had good days or great days, never bad days. And on the good days, sometimes that cloak came over my head and that was it. There was nothing else that was going to happen than me experiencing darkness, trying to go sleep and get up the next morning, because my thing was always joy comes in the morning. Because
Mm-hmm.
if you're alive, you're able to do something more than you did the day in front. But we're not allowing people to feel how they feel without pathologizing, right? And so in grief recovery, we talk about, emotional energy. Your emotional energy can actually change,
Mm-hmm.
right? There's so many things that people don't even realize, that because your emotional energy is changing, right? So you may get sick, right? It may be pain and frustration out of simple things. You may feel low and apathy. You don't feel driven to do anything anymore. But those things, when you think about it, are quite normal for somebody to experience something that will definitely shape their emotions.
Yeah.
Now, when we don't acknowledge it and acknowledge how people are actually feeling, that's where people stay, because they're always trying then to fight to show you this is how they feel.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, we talked about the universality of grief. Is there anything people can do to prepare? Is there anything we can do to improve our resilience for what really is the inevitable?
Um, I think one is to acknowledge that we experience grief every single day.
Mm-hmm.
Every single day. One, there's nothing wrong with you, right?
Yeah.
I think that's a big part. And then start to identify what have you lost, right? Because what grievers tend to do are, grievers are Academy Award winners, right? They pretend like everything is okay.
Mm-hmm.
And then when they don't get the support and they crash, people are like, but I thought she was going on so good.
Yeah.
I know nothing wrong with them, and they're really flabbergasted because we put out a really good front that we got all our stuff together. So I think for people is really to begin authenticating their story, right? Honestly, really authenticating their story. And then after that, you have to look. So in my world, we call it STIRBs, short-term energy relieving behaviors.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes our STIRBs can be very dangerous. It could be things like sex, buying too much clothes. It could be drug addiction. It could
Mm-hmm.
be isolation. And identify how those STIRBs are actually impacting your life. Because when you start to realize, well, look, I'm doing more of this because this is the way in which I'm coping, you stand a better chance of beginning to have a conversation about, okay, what do I need to change in order to get back on a track that I can actually manage and deal with my emotions. But again, if we don't have conversations about grief at the level that we need to begin having these conversations, then people's STIRBs will continue, and they won't complete the relationship, because ultimately that's what it boils down to. From birth, we are experiencing loss. I tell people, for any time a child comes out of the womb, that is loss. Because it no longer has the safety of a mother. Right? No, we don't don't process it anyway, like, oh my gosh, that child need to learn to get on instinct. So to stop getting on instinct. What we then do is we embrace the child's loss and we provide them with a comfort within the loss. And for me, I would like us to begin carrying that through all of our experiences, because all of our losses are valid. What comes to mind is this story now with the little boy who lost his life in the swimming pool, and the barrage of comments where people have forgotten that it is a life that is lost, and they have made it a mandate to share how they thought the child should have been parenting.
Yes.
And the aunt said a beautiful thing. She said, we all weep, but we don't all weep at the same time. So what for you today might not be for me tomorrow. And what for me tomorrow might not be for you today. And I don't think people are understanding that loss is a very human experience. We have to hold space for people that lose things. I hold space for the people who are in COVID, who are in horrible relationships, but they can't leave because literally they're now locked in the house with somebody because they can't find a different thing. I hold space for the people who have literally fashioned their life around tourism, and tourism now is null and void, and they don't know how to even pivot in this time now. We have to learn how to hold space for people's losses rather than have opinions of how they think the loss has impacted somebody. Because you never know unless you actually have a conversation with people. And because people are ill prepared to deal with loss, they're not going to have the conversation.
Yeah, so I mean, we talked a lot about, how people process grief and how they manage grief. But I guess the other thing I was wondering is, when would you say grief counseling or a support group or some kind of intervention is necessary? Is it always something we should do, or
Okay, so I'm torn on this for two reasons. So I changed the language from grief counseling to grief recovery because that's why I'm a grief recovery specialist. Grief counseling is something completely different. Bereavement counseling is something completely different. But what I would say is, what I would love is to teach people how to hold more space for people when things happen.
Okay.
Because nobody wants a complete stranger to come into their space when they've experienced something as large as grief is. And I find, let's use death as one thing. People will be like, well, man, we call the counselor because we don't want anything to happen. The only reason why you call the counselor is because you don't got the skills. That's the only reason why you call, I think we have to do a better job because everybody's experiencing. So over COVID, you had a couple deaths that people call me and I said, listen to me. I say, you are amply qualified to hold space for this person. You do not need me. You think you do, but you really don't. Hold space for them and just process, because sometimes what happens, and people don't understand from a physiological perspective, when you experience any type of loss that is trauma-based, your body does not regulate it for 72 hours. So the other language, people will call it shock.
Yeah.
Right? And oh my God, somebody in shock. But really and truly, your autonomic nervous system and your actual parasympathetic nervous system, all of them are trying to regulate with too much information. And sometimes we're trying to get people to eat, we're trying to get people to sleep. They can't do that. Unless they actually have these skill sets. So I tell people, even when my husband got sick, I came home the night after and I went in my bed and sleep, because I was like, well, I got chill, I got sleep, I can't be up, worrying whether or not he can be okay. And I don't think people understood that. I was like, but you understand that if I stay up, I can actually make myself much more sicker. But I had those skills. Other people may not have those skills. And so therefore then the body will kind of fight or flight or freeze, and then it will do what it knows best. And then you kind of have to recalibrate. So for the instances where people, can't control themselves, they're hysterical, yes. And other people around them may not have the skill set. But I think there are other instances where we have to really learn to hold space for each other in their grieving experiences. Women who lose babies through miscarriages and through abortions, how many people actually show up for those women?
Yeah.
because we don't talk. You may see a woman have a whole big belly for 7-8 months, and she loses the baby. She loses the baby, but you never say a word to her.
Yeah.
As if that baby never existed. That keeps people in a perpetual state of grief and loss. Right? So I think we do have to do a better job. I think there are instances where I've worked on many cases where, near drownings, accidents, and I've gone in and I've done grief recovery, acute crisis sessions with the entire teams that have been impacted.
Right.
And that works for them, right? And I'm always open to doing that, because the worst thing to do is try to process something that you don't understand without having a voice to say how you feel about it. And I love those sessions because the grief is palatable, but then also people's joy of knowing the person, maybe talking specifically with deaf here, it's very useful then to hear that other people, and then majority of cases that I've done, I've been blessed that it's been a lot of men and sometimes very young children. And so they get to hear how the magnitude of grief impacts the entire family, right? So I think, yes, there are instances where you do need somebody to come in, but everything does not require it. And we have to do a better job, because I would hate to be 10 years old and losing my mother, and the first person that comes to my aid is a stranger. What does that tell me about my grief experience,
And I guess when we talk about holding space and, supporting persons in the thick of grief, do we mean, simply letting them grieve, letting them express their feelings, sitting with those emotions? When we say holding space, it's just, trying to get a better concept.
So grievers like to talk, and people who hold space for them need to learn how to listen.
Okay.
And also, along with learning how to listen, I have a thing. Anybody comes into my therapeutic space knows this. I don't give you tissue. You reach for your own tissues, because I am not the person responsible for telling you to stop crying. And we do that with people all the time. They're crying, you give them a tissue. But why are you telling them they have to dry their tears? Because ultimately, that's what you're doing. Right? We have to learn to allow people. I tell people my rule of thumb is, if you got some snot, I will just tell you that because you got some snot. But you are allowed to have a cathartic moment. That's why we have tears, right? Also, holding space may be a physical touch. So as a grief recovery specialist, one of the things I absolutely love is that I get to hug the people that I work with. I have a colleague who is in Guyana, Marva Langevin, who she just did something, open a page called Marva Hugs, healing in relation to grief and S. I can't remember what the U for is, but she loves to hug. And what people don't understand is when you are losing something, it is a sense of security you're also losing. And there's nothing more secure than the art of touch.
Yeah.
The human touch. So we can learn to hold space for hearing people. When people share with me as a grief recovery specialist, I don't tell them what to do. Also, I actually share my own personal story with regards to my loss. I also share my own relationship history with the person that I've lost, and how because in loss, nobody's a villain or a martyr, right? Everybody's experience. So even the man who docks the pay of 20 people, we're like, oh my gosh, that person is such a bad human. But you don't know that person, if they did not lay off those people, was 2 days away from drinking Comoxone or shooting themselves, because they were so much in debt and they didn't know how to process the information. We don't go both sides, right? We always think that somebody's the victim. And in grief, my thing is, when you hold space, understand you're just holding space for somebody's story.
Okay. So while grief is devastating, humans are complex and resilient. So I was just wondering if, can significant loss sometimes be a catalyst for significant personal growth?
Absolutely. I think that is the essence of life. Birth, death, and love.
Interesting.
When somebody new enters the space, our realm changes. Who we are as individuals, if we're parents, if we're auntie, if we're a co-worker, we no longer are the same role that we had when the birth did not occur, when the birth occurs. Then fast forward to love. When you love somebody, that inherently could change the way in which your genetic makeup happens. It changes the physiological makeup of you, but it also gives you a sense of purpose. And then death. Death puts things in perspective. Death has put so much things in perspective for me. I tell people, Sunday could come on a Monday for me, and people don't understand that, right? I tell people, when you watch somebody literally die in front of you, because that's pretty much what happened with me and when my husband got the asthma attack. He had it directly in front of me, in the essence that I was asking him a question and I turned around to go and get something in response to what he said. And then when I came back, he had collapsed, non-responsive, that kind of stuff. And so when you experience that, you really truly understand that life is too short. There ain't nothing, there ain't no stressing me, no bill, no nothing. Like, you want this, come for this. Because I don't have the time for it, because you don't have tomorrow put down. And he was only 40 when it happened, you know? And so you don't have it put down. He was healthy, yes. Obviously, there were other things that were happening behind the scenes that I didn't see or he didn't see. But life is too short. And so therefore, for me, it's death. Death shows you, or loss in essence shows you that, what you think you have promised is never promised. Life, I tell people, COVID, people are, oh my gosh, COVID's the worst thing. I said, listen to me. Y'all just know, reaching a level of uncertainty, that people who lose people, or people who lose big jobs, or lose houses to fires and stuff like that, have always felt. That 1 minute things could be going so well, and then the next minute your life can be completely upside down.
Yep.
Right? So just know, join the club with COVID, right? Life has always been uncertain. Yeah. How have you managed to live through your own personal certainties? And my thing is, the certainties for me are love, commitment, connection. Those things matter, right? And so I think death provides you an opportunity, if you take it the best way you can, or if you take it the most effective way you can, your story comes out of that mess.
Okay. Well, lastly, I know you're a big advocate for self-care and, being a grief counselor, or a grief recovery specialist, as you say, and a wellness coach, among other things, that can lead to compassion fatigue. Yeah. So I was just curious as to, what does self-care look like for you?
Okay, so self-care for me is very interesting, because I tell people I love to sleep. I can sleep in the middle of anywhere, all that stuff. I also purposely pause. I am a big advocate for going on staycations by myself, so my voice becomes my own voice. I exercise. I like cooking. I do a lot of personal development work. Any training that I do is also akin to my self-care. And I also know how to say no and turn off people's challenges, because they're not mine. I think one of my strengths as a mental health professional is that I honor where people are at. I don't take on where people are at. And one of the things about compassion fatigue or burnout for mental health professionals is that they think they have to fix everybody's problems. I don't have to. Your mess is your mess. And if I am not the best person to help you through it, I will make a referral. Or if my inadequacies or inefficiencies as a therapist or a counselor begins to overshadow your ability to get better, I have to first do no harm. That's one of the first rules in mental health profession. And I think a lot of people, when they get into the mental health profession, they carry their egos with them. I don't have an ego in this world that I work in, because people are always going to make decisions whether or not you want them to do something. And I've just honored that my entire life. I worked in a setting where 40 hours a week or plus, from 8 to 5 every day, I was around men in addiction, women in addiction. And when you see them make decisions that may hurt your heart, you don't have the time to be like, oh my gosh, I can't believe this person. And all you have is the time to honor that that's the decision that they make. And but even when they get well, that is also a decision that they make.
Okay. So thank you, Janelle, for joining me today. You know, it was interesting, and hopefully your insights can help those who may be grieving and those of us, you know, trying to support them. So thank you so much. It was informative and quite interesting.
Thanks so much for having me and considering grief as a topic on your podcast.
Thank you. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to join us every other Wednesday for another episode of Shak. Subscribe to our podcast using your favorite podcast platform. We are on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and many more. You can also connect with us on IG, Facebook, and Twitter, or by email at akelia@shakshak.club. Let's shake things up.